Donald Trump, they're almost kind of begging for a ceasefire, for like, this
Yeah.
needs to stop now. The bleeding has to stop because they don't want to be part of what the end game is going to be. But then you have remarks like this. Here's what Donald Trump said to the media directly following all these talks that have been happening with Europe as well as Ukraine.
But we're getting closer. We're having tremendous support from European leaders. They want to get it ended also. And at this moment, Russia wants to get it ended. The problem is they'll want to get it ended, and then all of a sudden they won't. And Ukraine will want to get it ended, and all of a sudden they won't. So we have to get them on the same page. But I think that's working along. Very good talk.
So that's Donald Trump's interpretation of the situation. But what is the reality here, and what exactly is being proposed? Because there's been a lot of talk about what kind of ultimatums the U.S. is issuing to Ukraine. And a lot of this is happening outside of any contact really with Russia.
Well, I think the first point to make is the one that you made at the very start, which is that the Trump administration came in. I think they understood at some level that the war was indeed going badly, and they wanted it to stop, and they wanted it to end. Now, back in January, when Trump was inaugurated, it looked as if there was still a fair amount of time to do that. The Russians hadn't made the big advances that they made in the last few months. It didn't look yet as if Donbass was about to crumble. The Ukrainians were still in Kursk region, which is actually inside pre-2014 Russia. And there hadn't been these big Russian breakthroughs in Zaporozhye, and there wasn't this aerial campaign. So they took their time. They talked about a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines. They looked for a freeze of the conflict, a little like the freeze that there is in Korea. They thought, or they told themselves, that it was still basically a stalemate and that there was time to play and time to maneuver. And I think what has happened since the summer is that they finally understood that that really isn't the case at all. And that, in fact, they don't have that much time, that the Russians are advancing more quickly than they expected, that the Ukrainians are in worse shape, much worse shape than they expected. And they are now pressing to end the war much more quickly, and they're becoming more desperate about it. So you have Donald Trump, and what he's doing, and what his two very inexperienced negotiators, Witkoff and Kushner, are doing, who are not seasoned diplomats, is they're trying to move forward with some kind of process to stop the war by agreeing, when they meet one side or the other, with what the side that they're talking to wants. So the Russians say, we want the 5 regions, we want Ukrainian neutrality, we want Ukraine out of NATO, we want restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian army, and we want rights for Russian speakers. So that's what the Russians want. The Americans apparently, in the recent meeting that took place in Moscow, when Kushner and Witkoff went to Moscow, they said, this is fine, this is good, we can work with all of this, let's move forward with that. Then they've had another meeting in Berlin, and they come up against the Ukrainians, and they come up against the Europeans. And the Ukrainians say, we're not prepared to withdraw from any territory. We want a ceasefire on the existing lines. We accept that we perhaps can't join NATO now, but we still want security guarantees from the United States, and we want to have an army of 800,000 men. And Witkoff and Kushner say, yes, that's fine. The fact that these are two completely incompatible positions, that is where, unfortunately, we are. So Trump says that, the two sides are changing their positions all the time. The reality is that the Americans are agreeing with both at once about incompatible things.
You have the Trump administration, they have spoke to Russia. They have visited. Witkoff has been there a few times. You had the Alaska, you had all of these meetings phone calls with Putin, and yet the Trump administration will then come out and talk about security guarantees for Ukraine as if they didn't hear anything, as if that's not going to cause a major, what the media is calling an impasse, which I think is a false use of the word, but nonetheless, it's what they're using. So what explains this antagonism with this so-called negotiations?
Well, I think the Americans have never developed a proper negotiating strategy, and they've never really asked themselves, who is it that we should be negotiating with? What they're trying to do is that they're trying to present themselves as some kind of outside party which is coming to this conflict and out of some extraordinary act of benevolence is trying to find an acceptable compromise that will satisfy everybody, which of course is nonsense, because the United States is not an outside party. It is a direct participant. It's been arming Ukraine. It's been helping Ukraine with intelligence. It has imposed sanctions on Russia. It has, according to Trump himself, played a major role in provoking the war. So the Americans trying to persuade the Ukrainians and the Europeans, treating the Ukrainians and the Europeans as a partner that they should be negotiating with, which is very strange when you actually take a step back and see that these people ultimately are, as the US has itself admitted, are proxies. So it spends most of its time negotiating with its own proxies rather than doing what it needs to do, which is to negotiate with the other side, which is the Russians. So they have much more contact with the Europeans, with the Ukrainians, than they do with the Russians. And there's never been a proper sit-down, organized negotiation with the Russians, with properly formed negotiating teams, sending Witkoff to Moscow, getting him to go there every couple of weeks, having meetings with Putin, having the old phone call with Putin. That is not a negotiation, not a proper negotiation of the sort that's needed to end this war.
Right, and even the Alaska summit, it felt more about just making contact than it did about actually coming to some kind of settlement on this, as the two major players in it, the US being the root cause of the Ukraine conflict, and of course Russia being the one fighting it. But Russia has made its side pretty clear, Alexander, and I want to show you the much vaunted, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Independent. They actually reported on Russia's so-called refusal to give up land after Trump claims the peace deal is closer than ever. So Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, said that he is not aware, he has not been updated about the progress of recent talks with the proxies, and that he is shooting down the idea of a NATO peacekeeping force in post-war Ukraine after the U.S. finally said it is open to offering Article 5 style guarantees. That is shocking to that was shocking to me to hear that again, Alexander. Talk about why the United States is even talking about Article 5 like guarantees.
The reason the Americans are talking about Article 5 guarantees, and this is my own take. I mean, there's some people who take a very sinister take. They say that what the US is trying to do is to fool the Russians, to tell them that the Russians, well, we're not really actually going to bring Ukraine into NATO, but we're going to set up an arrangement which is identical in all respects to Ukraine entering NATO. And I mean, that is ultimately what will happen. But I think the purpose of this is to get the Ukrainians to agree to give up territory in Donbass to the Russians. So what the Americans are doing is, instead of telling the Ukrainians, look, we're very sorry, we have this arranged, we're coming to the conclusion that this war is lost, that it is in our national interests to stabilize relations with the Russians. Ultimately, you are our proxy, so we will do what we choose, and this is our policy, and we're going to move forward. And if you don't like it, well, you're on your own. Instead of doing that, What the United States is trying to do is to bribe the Ukrainians to agree to withdraw from Donbass by offering them instead security guarantees, which of course the Russians are going to reject. And the reason the Americans are doing that, the US is doing that, is again because of the point that you made earlier, that it's desperate to end the war as quickly as possible before the collapse comes. So it has to, they have to come back to the Russians with something. They could say, well, look, we're making progress. We've got the Ukrainians to agree that they are withdrawing from Donbass. So why can't we get a ceasefire now? Why can't we get a freeze? And we can sort out all of these other things. And don't worry about this business of security guarantees, Article 5 time security guarantees that we're giving to Ukraine. This is only going to be for a short time, a temporary period. That's, by the way, the messaging that's coming out at the moment. It's only for a short time, because eventually we will be able to iron this all out in the future. So they're bribing the Ukrainians with the security guarantees in order to persuade the Russians to stop. And in order to get the Russians to stop, they think that they can throw them a bone, which is the rest of Donbass. It is not a negotiating strategy. It's not the way this sort of thing is done. And the Russians, by the way, have made it absolutely clear that they want, yes, of course they want Donbass, but they want the rest of the 5 regions too. They want Zaporozhye and Kherson region. We went through the whole of the summer and the autumn with various claims in the media that the Russians had agreed to give up their claims to the totality of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, the other, 2 of the 4 regions. 4 regions. Turned out that was never true. The Russians never agreed to any such thing. But there we go. It is absolutely incompetent negotiation. It's trying to agree with everyone at once and think that if you can agree with somebody on one thing, you can get the other side to agree on something else.
Alexander, how much does the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself, somebody or maybe himself at the beginning of this process said it's a good idea to frame yourself as the mediator, but now it seems like that is bearing a lot of spoiled fruit in the sense that, yeah, the Trump administration is acting like a mediator, but unlike the strong language you see, let's say on Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine, we are going to dominate. You don't have that energy when it comes to Ukraine, even with Europe, despite all of the national security strategies bluster. There's still a lot of cordiality and attempts to come to a compromise, despite the fact that most of us have been saying, it's kind of ridiculous for the U.S. to be acting as the mediator in a conflict of its own making.
Well, can I just say something? I've actually worked as a mediator in disputes. It's something I used to do in my previous career. And nothing that is happening remotely resembles mediation as it should be conducted. Firstly, you're absolutely right. I mean, the United States is in no position to act as mediator because it is a party to the conflict and always has been. And by definition, you cannot mediate a conflict to which you are a party. That is one. But mediators are not there to, offer proposals to, in effect, negotiate with 2 sides at once. What mediators do is that they talk to each side, tell them, what is your ideas? This is what this person is concerned, the other side is concerned about. What are you going to do about that? Have you any thoughts? And gradually you get a position where you start to find common ground and you get the 2 together in a proper negotiating process. You bring them together into the same room. You narrow the points of dispute and you get them to start coming up with ideas with each other to work the way forward. So that's not what we're seeing here at all. What we're seeing is the United States conducting, in effect, bad faith negotiations with the Ukrainians and the Europeans at the same time as it is conducting bad faith negotiations with the Russians. Now, how did this happen? there is a very simple explanation. It's because Trump doesn't want it to seem that this is in any way his war. He wants to distance himself from it. So he says, I'm not really involved because I'm not involved. The United States isn't really involved. I am this benevolent person. I'm not trying to end the war because I can see that America is going to lose this proxy war. I'm doing this from a position of strength. There's the impartial, objective mediator who's coming in and purely out of benevolence is going to try to find a mutually satisfactory conclusion. Now, as I said, this is always a false premise. And here I would say that one can criticize the Russians because they perhaps ought to have said to Trump right from the outset, what you are proposing to do simply cannot work. You cannot be a mediator and a participant in the conflict at one and the same time.
You know, Russia's been definitely playing the we want the United States to be open to something, especially around normalization. It seems like that's been maybe more of an interest to Russia given the state of the Ukraine conflict. But you know, the U.S., the Donald Trump administration, has issued a kind of ultimatum to Ukraine about these security guarantees. What do you make of this? According to the Telegraph, Washington has reportedly warned Kiev that its offer of NATO-style security guarantees can expire if it doesn't accept peace terms soon. But nothing's been agreed upon, Alexander. So that's it. So agreeing to terms in order to get these security guarantees. What does this really accomplish? Why go through all of this? Does it serve any purpose at all? I would think that the Trump administration would do very well looking like a very powerful, rather than a mediator, but like an arbiter if it was to pull things along. But your thoughts on this?
It means absolutely nothing. The first thing to say is that the Ukrainians are not going to believe this. They've been on the receiving end, as by the way have the Russians, of any number of Trump ultimatums. I mean, do you remember back in August, Trump said that unless Russia agreed within 100 days to stop the war, he was going to impose 50%, 100% tariffs on Russia and 100% tariffs on any country that bought Russian oil. What happened to that? Then just a short time ago, we were getting reports that when there was the original 28 points, he wanted the Ukrainians to agree to the 28 points by Thanksgiving.
I think it was 2 weeks, right? It was a 2-week deadline.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
All that's come and gone, and it was still up. So I don't think the Ukrainians are going to take this ultimatum seriously. They're going to say, well, this man has offered us, the United States has offered us security guarantees, so that's now in our pocket. We can move on, and we're going to continue to dig in our heels because realistically, given especially that we have the backing of the Europeans, and by the way, many people in Washington, now that the US has offered us the security guarantees, told us that it's going to give us the security guarantees, it's not going to walk back on them. It's a commitment that it cannot walk back from. I mean, they may be wrong about that, but that I am sure is what the Ukrainians are thinking. And well, let's assume that it happened. Let's assume that this ultimatum was for real. And one of two things happened. The Ukrainians agree to pull back from Donbass, almost inconceivable, by the way, but let's assume they do. But the Americans come and say the Ukrainians have agreed to withdraw from Donbass, but they're going to get in return Article 5, NATO equivalent security guarantees. The Russians are going to say, you must be kidding. And so I mean, it already makes the whole thing, if you think about it, ridiculous, because it doesn't ultimately address the core issues, what the Russians referred to as the root causes, which is the origins of the war, NATO expansion, Ukraine's tilt towards the West, the Maidan events of 2014, and all of that.
Before we move to Europe, I wanted to ask you about the Ukrainian side. Is this for them a strategy of almost like suicide to get what you want? Like in order to, Trump administration will, wag its finger at its own proxy, and then the proxy Ukraine can say, okay, you're wagging your finger, but we're the ones who are doing the dying. We're the ones who are going to dig in our heels, as you said. And if we dig in our heels and continue to do that, what other option do you have but to try to save us, even if you say that you don't want to? So is this kind of do you find that might be part of the thinking amongst those who are pulling some of the strings inside of the Ukrainian regime?
I think you're absolutely right about this. I think this is the illusion, the dangerous illusion that there is in Kiev. They're saying to themselves, at the end of the day, we can stand firm. We can refuse all concessions because the Americans have invested so much in us that in the end, if it really comes to the point, they're going to step in and prevent us going down. That the humiliation for the United States would be too great for any other outcome. So the Ukrainians are saying, well, we can lose Donbass, we can lose Zaporozhye, we can get the Russians all the way up to the river. But if we concede what the Russians demand, then it's going to be a completely different Ukraine, not the Ukraine that we're fighting for. We will slip back into a kind of under Moscow's shadow. We don't want that under any circumstances, and we don't in the end have to agree to it, because if we stand firm, if we reject these demands, if it really does look as if we're going down, then the Americans and the Europeans will step in to save us, and not just save us, but enable us to win. Now, lots of countries have made that mistake. President Thieu of South Vietnam made that mistake, which is, it's a history I'm sure you are familiar with. President Al-Ghani of Afghanistan made that mistake. I don't believe that if Ukraine starts to go down, the United States is going to rush in to save it. But I think that in Kiev, many people, Zelensky himself, absolutely do.
I mean, isn't part of the problem too? What will the United States do? It seems like the United States has done everything it can do to push this conflict as far as it can go, and we are where we are right now. What else could the United States do, Alexander?
Well, that's an excellent point, because practically there isn't anything more that the United States can do. But when the United States comes and tells people in Kiev, we are the mighty, all-powerful United States, you're up against a country that has only a fraction of our power, which is to say Russia, that is, gas station masquerading as a country and all of that. If you're Ukrainian and you really want to escape the Moscow's shadow, and you believe that, it's very difficult to stop believing it. So the Ukrainians will probably say to themselves, well, there's lots of things the Americans can do. They can give us more weapons. They cannot imagine that there is a real situation where Russia can actually outproduce the mighty United States in terms of weapons. They can choke off Russia's oil exports. Again, it's difficult, perhaps, if you're in Kiev, to believe that the United States actually cannot do that, that choking off Russia's oil exports entirely will create economic problems in the United States itself and will not be accepted by China, which is Russia's biggest customer for oil, and that the Chinese, if they are threatened economically by the United States, have repeatedly shown that they're prepared to take counter action. And of course, there's always, perhaps at the back of everybody's mind in Kiev, the belief that the United States could step into the war directly, that it can establish a no-fly zone, the Ukrainians were demanding a no-fly zone early on in the war, there is a reluctance to believe that the United States cannot and will not do that, that it really will run out of missiles, air-to-air missiles, if it starts shooting down Russian missiles. Because for the Ukrainians to admit to themselves that the United States does indeed have those limits is to say that they gambled everything on American assurances that America cannot fulfill. And that is something psychologically and politically, which I suspect it is impossible for the leaders in Kiev